I stood there, my fingers frozen around the paperwork as the door slammed behind him. My son's words still rang in my ears, colder than the winter wind. "You belong in a nursing home, Mom." I watched him drive off without a second glance, leaving me in the house I built, the life I created, and the debt he tried to bury me under. But he was wrong. This time it was my turn to close the door. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The paper bag in Helen's arms sagged slightly under the weight of canned beans, bread, and a small carton of milk. Her keys jingled faintly as she nudged open the front door with her elbow. "David," she called out, not sharply, just enough to be heard. "Could you help bring in the rest of the groceries from the car?" He didn't answer at first. From the living room, the flicker of the flat screen danced across his lounging frame, feet up on her coffee table, a can of beer sweating onto her wedding photo coaster. She was halfway to the kitchen when he finally spoke. "You know what, Mom?" he said without moving his eyes from the screen. "You really belong in a nursing home, not juggling canned goods like some delusional Wonder Woman." Behind her, she heard Kelly's laugh. Light, controlled, with that too sweet pitch that always meant she was about to say something awful. "We'd have so much less to worry about if she was," Kelly added, not even pretending to whisper. "Honestly, it's kind of irresponsible at her age. What if she falls carrying groceries?" Helen stood very still in the hallway. The bag pressed into her forearm, digging a small line into her skin. Her breath caught, then smoothed. She set the groceries down silently on the counter. No reply, no glare, just the quiet closing of a cabinet, a flick of the light switch, and the ticking of the kitchen clock. "Hey, where's the oat milk?" David called a moment later. "Don't tell me you forgot." She didn't answer. Not that she had forgotten, it was sitting in the car along with the rest of the bags. Let him walk outside and look. They didn't even notice when she slipped out the back door. The late afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, stretching long golden lines across the lawn. A dry breeze rustled the dogwood tree, its leaves turning brittle at the edges. Helen walked slowly to the edge of the yard, hands trembling slightly before she folded them neatly in front of her. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that. But her jaw clenched, and her gaze locked on the horizon with a fury that had no outlet. "Not yet." "They think I'm done," she muttered, barely audible. Behind her, a familiar crunch of sandals on gravel. "Is this about the car again?" Joan Reeves asked, stepping through the open gate, her graying bob bouncing slightly as she walked. "Because I swear, if David left that oil stain in your driveway again, I'll egg his tires." Helen didn't turn around. Her voice was low, almost flat. "He told me I belong in a nursing home." Joan blinked, then tilted her head. "He said that out loud?" Helen nodded. "And Kelly?" What did she say? She laughed, said it'd be easier for them. Joan let out a long, slow whistle. "They don't know you very well, do they?" Now Helen turned. Her eyes, usually gentle and warm like oatmeal cookies fresh from the oven, had sharpened to something glassy and precise. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, "and I'm not done." Joan crossed her arms, lips twitching with something between admiration and readiness. "What are you thinking?" Helen looked back toward the house, her house, the place she had lived in for 42 years, where she had balanced budgets, wiped tears, buried a husband, and survived every storm thrown her way. "I'm thinking they've mistaken kindness for weakness. I'm thinking it's time they learn the difference." Joan stepped closer, her tone dropping low. "I'll bring the coffee. You bring the plan." Helen's mouth curved into the faintest smile. She looked back at her kitchen window where David now stood, yelling something she couldn't hear. Oat milk, probably. She didn't move, just watched him like a hawk considering a field mouse. And then she said it, softly but with weight. "Let's show them how wrong they are." The Civic's old engine coughed to a start as Joan adjusted the rearview mirror and backed out of Helen's narrow driveway. It was early, too early for errands, too late for breakfast, and the sun hadn't yet burned off the fog hovering just above the asphalt. Helen sat rigid in the passenger seat, lips drawn into a thin, unreadable line. They didn't talk for the first few blocks. It wasn't silence out of tension, just the kind that settles when something big is shifting under the surface. Finally, Joan glanced over. "You sure about this?" Helen didn't answer right away. She turned to look out her window at a passing row of vacant storefronts, their sun-bleached for lease signs fluttering in the breeze. "I've lived my life by the rules," she said quietly. "Taught my son to do the same. Guess only one of us was listening." Joan tapped the blinker. "Then it's time we play by a different rule book." They pulled into a cramped parking lot outside a squat brown brick building that could have been anything: a dentist's office, a tax place, a cheap therapist. But the small green sign above the door read, "Franklin County Legal Aid. Walk-ins welcome." Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and strong coffee. The receptionist, a young woman with purple glasses and a tight bun, glanced up from her keyboard. "Can I help you?" Joan leaned in slightly. "My friend needs legal assistance, financial exploitation, possibly criminal." That got the woman's attention. She handed them a clipboard without a word. 20 minutes later, a slim man in rolled-up shirt sleeves and a charcoal tie stepped into the waiting room. His voice was calm but clear, almost clinical. "Helen Markham?" Helen stood, clutching her canvas tote against her side like a shield. "I'm Miles Porter," he said, extending a hand. "Let's talk." His office was smaller than she expected. Tidy. A stack of legal books towered precariously beside a dusty window. A potted plant in the corner looked half dead but stubborn. Miles gestured for her to sit, then flipped open a notepad. "You said this involves your son?" Helen took a slow breath. "My son and his wife have been pressuring me to leave my home. They've started intercepting mail. Bills with charges I didn't make. I've found opened envelopes. My name attached to things I never signed." He listened without interruption, just a slight furrow of the brow, the occasional scribble on his pad. When she finished, he leaned forward. "Do you know whose name is on your house title?" Helen didn't hesitate. She reached into her tote, pulled out a manila folder, and slid the deed across the desk. The paper was crisp, well kept, like every document she'd ever filed as a school secretary. One signature adorned the bottom. Miles studied it, then smiled. Not smugly, strategically. "Then we're already ahead." Joan let out a soft breath behind her. Miles tapped the folder with his pen. "Here's what we do next. We request your credit reports from all 3 bureaus. I'll also get property and lien records pulled. If there's anything fishy, we'll find it." Helen looked at him squarely. "And if they've already done damage?" He didn't blink. "Then we build. Slowly, carefully. Paper trail first, courtroom later." She nodded. There was a flicker in her eyes. Less fear, more fuel. "I've kept notes," she said. "Receipts, dates, conversations." Miles grinned. "Then we're more than ahead." As he jotted down a list of next steps, Joan reached over and squeezed Helen's hand under the desk. No words exchanged, just pressure. Steady, proud. But before they left, Helen hesitated by the door. If they've used my name, credit cards, loans, I want it traced." Miles looked up, his tone sharpening just slightly. "That's identity fraud, Ms. Markham. I don't care if it's your son or the Pope. We prosecute it the same." Helen nodded once, her grip tightened on her tote. "Good." As they stepped back into the brisk air outside, Joan fished for her car keys. "How do you feel?" Helen's eyes were focused, hard as granite. "Like the game just started, and I'm not playing defense anymore." The mail usually hit the box around 11:15. Helen knew this because she'd always timed her walks that way, a quiet lap around the block, then back to the mailbox with her keys already in hand. But since David and Kelly had moved in, she hadn't had a single walk to herself. That morning, she stood at the kitchen window, a steaming mug of chamomile tucked in her palms, watching the mail carrier pull away from the curb. The red flag on the box was down. 10 seconds later, Kelly was already outside. No shoes, no coat, Just a lazy stretch of her arms and a flick of her bleached ponytail as she padded across the lawn in pajama bottoms that still had a marshal's tag dangling off the drawstring. Helen's fingers gripped the mug tighter. Kelly opened the mailbox, pulled everything out in a loose, greedy sweep, and didn't even pretend to glance back at the house. Helen moved fast and quiet, slipping down the hall and into the front entry just as the door creaked open. She ducked behind the coat rack. Kelly walked in humming, rifling casually through the envelopes like she was shopping, flipping, sighing, tossing junk mail aside. Then she paused. A pale yellow statement with red lettering across the top. Helen stepped out from behind the door just as Kelly tore it open. "You planning to pay that one for me too?" Kelly jumped, the envelope fluttering to the floor. "Jesus, Helen, don't sneak up like that." "I wasn't sneaking," Helen said coolly. "This is my house. That's my bill." Kelly's smile cracked at the edges. "Oh, it's just mail. David said you sometimes forget to check it, so I was—" Helen raised her phone and snapped a photo. Flash on. The torn envelope, the startled look, the frozen guilt in Kelly's eyes. "Don't worry," Helen said, slipping the phone into her sweater pocket. "I remember plenty." Kelly's voice dropped an octave. "You're being dramatic." "I'll let the courts decide." Helen left the envelope on the floor and walked into the kitchen without another word. Her hands were steady now. That afternoon, she called Joan. "You're sure you got the photo?" Joan asked. "Crystal clear. And the envelope has your name on it?" "Front and center." Joan whistled low through her teeth. "Stack the evidence. Quietly. Don't let them know what you've got." "I won't. You're a damn iceberg right now, Helen. Just let them keep bumping into the tip." By the end of the day, Helen had texted Miles a short summary, just enough to flag the incident, just enough to keep things on record. He called back within 10 minutes. "This is what we're going to do," he said, voice calm, confident. "First, I want you to forward all incoming mail to a P.O. box. Don't use your street address on anything new. That includes utility bills, bank correspondence, and any legal documents I send." Helen jotted it all down in her ledger, notepad style, the same way she used to track absent students. "Second," he continued, "install a lockable mailbox. Home Depot carries decent ones. Doesn't have to be expensive, just tamper-proof." "Got it." "And lastly, document every piece of mail that looks opened, moved, or missing. Photos, dates, timestamps." "Already started." He paused for half a second. "You're good at this." "I was a school secretary for 32 years, she said dryly. "I ran a building full of hormonal teenagers. This is cake." That evening, while David and Kelly bickered loudly about the thermostat in the living room, Helen knelt quietly beside the old oak hutch in the hallway. She slipped a narrow envelope inside, one addressed to her new P.O. box, marked personal. She shut the drawer gently, then locked it. Kelly's laughter bubbled from the couch like champagne poured over sour milk. Helen exhaled slowly. She knew the tide was shifting, not fast, but steady, and she was learning to ride it with precision. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A new voicemail. Anonymous. She hit play. The voice was muffled, but familiar. "Hope you enjoyed that hospital bill, you old bat. There's more where that came from." She didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her ledger and began to write. The envelope was thicker than usual, pale blue, stamped URGENT in red. Helen found it in her locked mailbox early Monday morning, tucked between a coupon flyer and a water bill. She didn't open it outside. She waited until she was seated at the kitchen table, ledger open, pen in hand, coffee going cold beside her. She sliced it open with the edge of a butter knife. One glance at the bold figures printed across the top and her heart skipped, not with panic, but with pressure. A slow-building heat in her chest. $3,842.61. Emergency room services, Mount Carmel East Hospital. Patient, David Markham. Guarantor, Helen Markham. Her hand hovered above the table. She turned the page in her ledger, drew a fresh line, and wrote, "August 14th, hospital bill for David. I did not sign anything. I was not there. Fraud." By the time Joan pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, Helen was already outside, standing by the mailbox like she'd been stationed there all night. Joan rolled down the window. "Morning, sunshine? You look like someone just told you bingo was rigged." Helen held up the hospital bill. "They've gotten bolder." 15 minutes later, they stood at the billing office inside the beige and windowless wing of Mount Carmel's administrative building. The air smelled of toner and lemon cleaner. A clerk with a frosted hairdo and overlong nails clicked away at a keyboard behind bulletproof glass. "I'm here to dispute a medical charge," Helen said, sliding the letter under the glass. "I'm listed as the guarantor. I didn't authorize this." The clerk blinked, took the paper, and squinted at her monitor. "Markham, David. ER visit? Yep, we've got the file." She printed something and handed it through the slot, a form with an attached copy of a digital intake sheet. Helen scanned the bottom of the page. Then she saw it. Her signature. Sort of. It looked like someone had tried to copy it from a birthday card, just enough curve to fake it. But the L was off. Her L always looped twice. "That's not mine," Helen said. "I've been signing documents the same way since 1972. This is forged." The clerk's face twitched with a mix of discomfort and practiced neutrality. "You'll need to file a fraud dispute with legal. I can give you their fax number." Helen smiled thinly. "My attorney will be in touch." Outside, Joan slammed the car door harder than usual. "They're digging their own grave," she muttered. "They're using my name to pay for his bad habits," Helen said, folding the paper slowly like it was evidence in a murder trial. "And they're leaving a paper trail." That afternoon, she met Miles at his office. He read the documents twice, quietly, then pulled out a dispute form, a notarization slip, and clicked his pen. "I'll file it by end of day," he said. "This qualifies as medical identity fraud. Hospitals take it seriously, especially with elder cases." He paused, then added, "Want me to loop in law enforcement?" Helen didn't hesitate. "Yes?" Officer Rhea Nolan showed up at Helen's house the next day in a navy windbreaker with a department patch over the left breast. She looked young but not green, the kind of woman who knew how to fill out forms and make grown men cry when they pushed too far. "This isn't the first time I've heard about adult children doing this," Officer Nolan said as she took Helen's statement. "But you're doing exactly what you should, documenting everything." Helen led her into the kitchen where she'd cleared off the table and opened her new logbook. Inside, dates, mail photographs, copies of bills, and notes in her tight, looping handwriting. "I've logged every time they've tampered with something, every charge, every lie." Nolan nodded. "Keep going. This could easily escalate to a full financial exploitation case." As the officer stepped back onto the porch, Helen caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. Not old, not fragile, prepared, but just as she locked up for the night, her phone vibrated with a new text. "Unknown number. You think you're smart? That ER bill was just a warm-up. You want to play this game? Fine. Let's see what happens next, Mom." Helen didn't respond. She just reached for her ledger, turned a new page, and wrote the date at the top. The printout was nearly 10 pages long. Miles slid it across his desk like it was a stack of X-rays showing a slow-growing cancer. Helen didn't flinch as she scanned the first page. She'd expected something, maybe a credit card or two, but not this. Capital One, Macy's, Lowe's, a gas card from Shell, and something called Express Medical Lending, all under her name, all opened in the last 11 months. "That's not just carelessness," Miles said. "That's intent." Helen looked up. "David?" Probably. But look here." He pointed to a tiny entry buried on page 4. "Authorized user, Kyle D. Markham. Their son." Helen's spine went cold. "He's 15? Miles nodded grimly. "Illegally attaching a minor to open lines of credit in someone else's name? That's another charge. They're not even being careful anymore." Helen blinked hard, willing her voice not to tremble. "They used their son as cover." "They used you to build a fake financial identity," Miles said, "which means we go nuclear now." He opened a drawer, pulled out a stack of forms and a folder labeled Identity Theft Recovery, Senior Protocol. "We're freezing your credit, everywhere, TransUnion, Equifax, Experian. You'll get PINs to unlock it when needed. We're also blocking all active accounts and filing identity theft affidavits with the FTC. Helen began signing as he walked her through each line. Each pen stroke was slower than the last, not from hesitation, but gravity. By the time she left the office, the gears of a much bigger machine had begun to turn. It was 2 days later, inside a strip mall shoe store, when the storm broke. Kelly stood at the counter, arms full of boxes. Blush pumps, black slingbacks, a ridiculous pair of bedazzled sneakers. She handed over a department store credit card with a flourish. The cashier swiped, paused, swiped again. "Sorry, ma'am, it's declining." Kelly frowned. "Try again." A third swipe. "Nope. It says the account's frozen. You might need to call the card issuer." "I just used it last week," Kelly snapped. "Maybe there's a fraud flag on it?" the girl suggested. "That's happening to a lot of people lately." People had started watching. A mom with a stroller, a teenage couple behind her in line. One of the store clerks subtly pulled out a phone and pretended to check inventory. Camera lens pointed her way. Kelly's cheeks flushed bright red. She grabbed her purse and shoved everything back into the cart. In the car, she called David. "What the hell is going on?" she hissed. "Every card I try is blocked. They're all under her name." I don't know," David stammered. "I tried opening a line for the truck this morning and it flagged me for fraud. They said my name's under investigation." "Oh my God, David." Her voice was rising. "You told me you had this under control." Back at home, Helen sat in her living room calm as ever, sipping from a glass of iced tea. The mailbox keys, new credit freeze letters, and FTC affidavit receipts sat in a tidy folder beside her. She flipped through it, methodical. At the very back was a copy of the identity theft report, notarized just that morning at the UPS store down the street. Miles had instructed her to send it to the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, which she'd done on the way home. Her phone buzzed. Joan. "They're unraveling, aren't they?" Helen allowed herself the smallest smile. "Starting to." "Every lie they told is just another nail in their coffin," Joan said. "You're building the whole thing one affidavit at a time." Helen walked to her file cabinet and slid the report into a fresh manila folder labeled Fraud. David Kelly. Active. But just as she shut the drawer, she heard it, a loud slam against the front door. Then David's voice, furious, cracking through the wood like a storm behind it. "You froze my credit? You're gonna pay for this, you bitter old witch." Helen didn't even blink. She picked up her phone, hit record, and pointed it at the door. "Come on in, David," she murmured, voice low and even. "Let's put it all on the record." The call came at 8:12 a.m., just as Helen was buttering a slice of toast. "Hi, Mrs. Markham. This is Julie from Buckeye Chevrolet. We're finalizing paperwork for the Silverado lease co-signed under your name. We just need a quick verbal confirmation of your income and address." Helen blinked once, then carefully set down her knife. "I didn't co-sign anything," she said, voice sharp. "Oh," the woman on the other end stammered. "Well, we do have a signature here. You're listed as guarantor. The paperwork was submitted online yesterday evening." Helen turned slowly to her filing cabinet. Her identity theft affidavits were in a labeled folder, already notarized, already submitted, already documented. "Is the vehicle still on hold?" "It's pending final release. Would you like to dispute the co-signature?" Helen didn't hesitate. "I'd like to report fraud." Silence. Then the dealership voice dropped into scripted professionalism. "Yes, ma'am. I'll flag the transaction and notify our finance department. You may receive a follow-up call." Helen hung up, calmly. Then she called Miles. Miles didn't even sound surprised. "They're desperate. They're going for big-ticket grabs now," he said, already typing in the background. "I'll forward the new fraud alert to the 3 bureaus, and I'll send it to the dealership's finance arm and their collections agency. That way, this application dies on all fronts." "Can you also notify Officer Nolan?" Helen asked. "I want it in the report." "Already on it." Miles's tone changed just slightly. There was a bite to it now. This kind of overreach? This plays well in court. They're not just reckless anymore. They're criminal and obvious. Helen hung up, feeling the strange warmth of power humming beneath her skin. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one being caught off guard. It wasn't long before the fallout reached her doorstep. Again. This time it came with footsteps, fast, stomping, furious. Helen looked up from her ledger as David stormed through the front door without knocking. His face was flushed, jaw twitching, hair uncombed and shirt halfway untucked like he hadn't slept. "You blocked the truck," he growled. "You told them I committed fraud?" Helen didn't move from her seat. "Because you did." "You're ruining me," he shouted. "You think you're so clever, filing reports, freezing accounts, making me look like some criminal?" She reached for her phone. "Hit record." David didn't notice. "My credit's torched. My dealership contact won't answer. Collections called me this morning asking for clarification on a loan I never even got. What the hell are you doing to me?" Helen looked up, voice even. "David, if you raise your voice one more time in this house, I'll call Officer Nolan, and this time she'll see everything live." That made him pause, just long enough for Helen to point her phone directly at him. "You think this'll hold up?" he hissed, eyes narrowing. "You're gonna lose this house, you know. You can't fight forever." Helen didn't blink. "I'm not fighting. I'm documenting." David laughed bitterly, pacing like a man untethered. "This is harassment, Mom! You're harassing me! Over what? A couple credit cards and a truck?" She rose to her feet, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward him. "Not just the cards, not just the truck. You opened accounts in my name, you forged my signature. You used Kyle as a fake co-applicant. You listed me as a guarantor for medical charges I never saw." She stepped closer. "You abused my trust, my name, my records. That's not just betrayal, David. That's a felony." His breath hitched, and then his eyes shifted, past her, toward the entryway, where Joan now stood silently, holding her phone. Also recording. "Morning," Joan said flatly. "Please keep going. The light's really good in here." David stumbled back, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out the front door. The slam rattled the window glass. Joan exhaled. "He's spiraling." Helen walked back to the table, shut off the recording, and tapped SAVE. "Let him." But as she sat back down, her phone buzzed with a new text. "Kelly, you think humiliating him helps? Watch your back. You're playing with things you don't understand." Helen stared at the screen for a moment. Then she tapped open new entry in her digital backup log. Evidence greater than threats, greater than 8:53 a.m., greater than Kelly Markham. She didn't respond. She just hit attach screenshot and saved it to the cloud. The first beep of the tow truck's reverse alarm echoed down the cul-de-sac like a slow countdown to justice. Joan stood beside Helen on the front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the spectacle unfold like it was primetime TV. The sky was clear, crisp blue, and Kelly's white Lexus SUV was already halfway on the lift. "Damn," Joan said. "I thought they'd wait till at least 10 a.m. to humiliate her." Helen sipped slowly. "They're early. Must have been a priority call." Down by the curb, Kelly stood barefoot in the driveway, flailing her arms and shouting at the repo team. One of the workers handed her a clipboard without even making eye contact. She hurled it onto the lawn. David appeared seconds later, still in sweatpants and a t-shirt that read, "Number 1 Dad," his face blotchy with sleep and rage. "Get the hell off my property," he barked. "Not your property," Joan muttered under her breath. The tow driver calmly attached the rear hook, ignoring the growing tantrum behind him. "You can't take that!" Kelly shrieked. "This is a mistake. My husband will fix it." "He's already tried," Helen whispered, "and failed." A neighbor across the street, Mr. Leduc, who never waved unless it was trash day, was openly filming the entire meltdown on his phone. 2 teenagers on scooters rolled by, laughing under their breath. One of them shouted, "Damn!" David turned toward the porch, eyes finding Helen's. "You think this is funny?" he spat. "You think wrecking your own family makes you a hero?" Helen didn't speak, just lifted her phone, tapped record, and aimed it his way. Joan, grinning, whispered, "There it is. The meltdown for the archives." David stomped back toward the curb. "You'll regret this. You hear me?" The truck pulled away with a groan of gears, Kelly running behind it uselessly, sobbing, arms flailing like she'd just lost a child. An hour later, Helen sat across from Miles in his office, sliding a USB drive across the desk. 3 videos, 3 different angles, all taken from neighbors' phones, labeled by date and time. Miles plugged it in, clicked through the files, and smiled. Oh, this is gold. He printed stills from the footage, David's face contorted in rage, Kelly clawing at the air, their voices raised and public. He clipped them neatly into a folder labeled Reputation Damages, Markham. They want to fight in court? Fine, we fight with receipts. This is public record now. Helen nodded, pulling out a smaller folder from her tote bag. Also, I want to file a small claims suit. Miles raised a brow. For? Utilities, groceries, and incidental costs I've covered for the last 4 months. He scanned the spreadsheet she'd created, every item tracked. Gallons of milk, detergent, trash service, even the precise usage spike on her water bill since they moved in. You know this adds up to almost $2,000? I know. He nodded approvingly. I'll file it this week. That evening, Officer Nolan met them at a coffee shop off Westerville Road. She didn't wear her uniform, but the badge clipped to her belt made her presence known. After reviewing the footage and the texts, I'm recommending a formal restraining order, she said, stirring cream into her coffee. Helen, you've done everything right. Most people don't get this far before damage sets in. They didn't expect me to push back, Helen said. They expected you to fold, Joan added. Nolan nodded. They assumed 70 meant powerless. Helen stared out the window at a young couple walking hand in hand, laughing. She didn't envy their youth. She envied their peace. I want it filed, she said. Let the court decide how close they get. Joan leaned in, lowering her voice as she watched traffic pass. You've hit them where it hurts now? Comfort's gone? Reputation's cracking? Helen's eyes narrowed. Every debt, she said softly, is just another brick in their cell. Joan leaned back and whistled. You've got bars and blueprints. I'll bring the mortar. But just then, Helen's phone buzzed again. This time the message was from an unknown number. Screenshot attached a photo of her house. From across the street, no caption, no text, just her home. Watched. The courtroom wasn't grand, just a square room with gray carpet, fluorescent lights, and benches that creaked when you shifted. But the tension? Palpable. Heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Helen sat beside Miles at the plaintiff's table, her folder neatly labeled, her posture straight, and her cardigan buttoned just so. Joan was tucked into the back row, a thermos of peppermint tea at her feet, knitting needles in her lap, silent but electric. Across the aisle, David and Kelly looked like they'd been dragged through a wind tunnel. David's blazer was wrinkled, his tie knotted too tight. Kelly wore too much makeup, like she was trying to paint over panic. They wouldn't meet Helen's eyes. The bailiff called the docket number, and the judge, a tall black woman with reading glasses and a braided bun, peered over the rim of her bench. Markham versus Markham, she said. Let's proceed. Miles stood, calm and steady. Your Honor, this is a preliminary hearing to determine the merit of a restitution claim related to fraudulent financial activity and identity theft perpetrated by the defendants, David and Kelly Markham, against the plaintiff, Helen Markham. He handed a copy of the evidence binder to the clerk. This contains detailed documentation of forged signatures, unauthorized credit accounts, financial statements, and notarized affidavits from both the plaintiff and third-party institutions. The judge flipped open the folder, eyes narrowing as she skimmed. You're saying the defendants used the plaintiff's identity to open accounts and secure assets without consent? Yes, Your Honor, Miles replied, and there is audio and video documentation of threats, financial exploitation, and verbal harassment, all compiled over the last 6 months. David's attorney, a man who looked barely out of law school, stood. Objection. The plaintiff's son didn't knowingly commit fraud. There may be misunderstandings, but these claims are exaggerated and driven by personal animus. Miles cut in smoothly. We have hospital records showing forged co-signatures. Retail accounts opened with the plaintiff's social security number. Surveillance footage of property repossession after non-payment, under Helen's name. The judge held up a hand. To the defendant's counsel, she said sharply, I suggest you stop talking until I've had time to read. The room went still. Helen remained composed, hands folded. When the judge looked directly at her, she rose on cue. Mrs. Markham, do you wish to make a statement? Helen stepped forward, voice clear and even. I worked as a school secretary for 40 years. I balanced more budgets than I can count. Student records, staff reimbursements, grant funds. I remember every number I touch. She turned toward the defense table, and I remember the moment I realized my name had been used for things I never signed, things I never saw, by the people who were supposed to protect me. Kelly shifted uncomfortably, jaw clenched. I started documenting everything, Helen continued, because when people think you're old, they think you'll forget. But I didn't. She placed one hand lightly on the folder. Everything's in here, from the first piece of stolen mail to the last overdraft charge. The judge watched her for a beat longer than necessary. Then she looked back at the file in front of her. I'm granting a formal restitution trial, she said. The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed on grounds of identity fraud, financial abuse, and intentional defamation of character. David exhaled harshly. Kelly's lips parted like she might object, but no sound came out. The judge continued, flipping to the back of the binder. I also see that you've already filed a restraining order request. That will be reviewed separately, but it's noted here. Miles leaned toward Helen and whispered, We're in. From the back of the courtroom, Joan gave a single firm clap before catching herself and switching it into a subtle cheer, with her knitting needles tapping together like castanets. The judge glanced up. We will reconvene in 2 weeks for testimony and evidence presentation. Until then, no further financial activity may be conducted under the plaintiff's name. She slammed the gavel once. Case advanced. As they gathered their papers, Helen's phone vibrated quietly in her purse. One new email. Subject line, restitution trial, anonymous submission. Attached was a PDF file. She opened it slowly. Inside, a signed lease agreement for a storage unit, under her name. Dated last week. The courtroom was fuller this time. Word had gotten out. A few reporters sat near the back with notepads half tucked beneath their jackets. A legal studies class from Columbus State had taken up the far-right bench, whispering behind clipboards and peeking at Helen like she was the subject of a live case study. Helen ignored them. She sat beside Miles in the same pressed cardigan, same labeled folder, but today her eyes had a sharper edge. David and Kelly shuffled in late. David's shirt was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed. Kelly looked drained, lips tight and face paler than usual. No eye contact, no jewelry, just damage control in heels. All rise, the bailiff called. The judge adjusted her glasses and gave a small nod. Let's proceed with the plaintiff's submission of evidence. Miles stood, voice steady. Your Honor, today we submit Exhibit D through G. These include a notarized fraud affidavit submitted to Mount Carmel East regarding a forged guarantor signature on an ER bill totaling $3,842.61 opened under the plaintiff's name without her consent. He passed the packet to the clerk. We also submit the billing clerk's statement verifying the falsified intake documents and the signed fraud dispute form filed by Ms. Markham's legal counsel. The judge's brow lifted slightly. Was this fraud reported to law enforcement? Miles nodded. Yes, and the responding officer is present to testify. The door in the back opened and Officer Rhea Nolan walked in, calm, composed, badge glinting in the light. She stepped up to the stand, raised her right hand, and swore in. Officer Nolan, Miles began, can you describe the report you filed on behalf of Ms. Markham? Nolan nodded. On August 14th, Ms. Markham provided me with documentation of suspected financial exploitation, including hospital charges she did not authorize and mail tampering. I collected statements, copies of the forged signature, and photographs of tampered correspondence. She looked at the judge directly. I determined there was sufficient cause to categorize it as felony elder financial abuse under Ohio Revised Code 2913.49. A small murmur rippled across the benches. Kelly's head sank lower. Miles continued, Officer, did you also receive evidence of verbal threats made toward the plaintiff? Yes. Voicemails, texts, and recorded confrontations. David's lawyer scrambled to his feet. Objection! Those recordings weren't disclosed. They're being entered now, Miles replied coolly, sliding a flash drive to the clerk. Exhibit H, recorded verbal harassment from the defendant, David Markham, captured by the plaintiff on August 9th. The judge turned to Helen. Would you like to play the footage? Helen stood and walked to the provided monitor with calm certainty. She tapped the spacebar. David's voice filled the courtroom, distorted by the cheap phone mic but unmistakable. You're gonna pay for this, you bitter old witch. You froze my credit? You think you're clever? The judge didn't flinch. She just made a note. Then came the second clip, David storming across Helen's living room, red-faced, unhinged. And in the background, Joan's voice, steady and amused. Please keep going, the light's really good in here. Silence settled when the video ended. Even the reporter in the back had stopped writing. Miles turned slowly to the defense. But before he could speak, Kelly blurted, "She wasn't helpless! She gave us access!" David turned, stunned. "Kelly, you said we could use her name if it helped our chances," she hissed, eyes now wild. "She was useful, until she started recording everything." A gasp rolled through the courtroom like a ripple of dropped pins. The judge straightened in her chair. "Ms. Markham," she said to Kelly, "are you stating under oath that you and your husband knowingly used your mother-in-law's personal information to obtain credit?" Kelly froze. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. David sat back like someone had pulled the last thread in his life loose. "I'm halting proceedings," the judge said coldly, and issuing a formal recommendation to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges, including identity theft, elder abuse, and potential conspiracy to defraud. Her gavel hit the desk with finality. The room exploded in whispers. Helen didn't move. She didn't smile. She simply placed a hand over her folder and whispered to herself, "One more brick." By the next morning, the headlines had already spread farther than Helen expected. Elder identity theft case in Columbus may trigger criminal charges. Judge refers financial abuse case to Franklin County DA. Son accused of exploiting mother's credit. Trial to expand. Helen read them from her phone as she stirred her oatmeal. The sun hadn't even cleared the trees yet, but her email was full, mostly support, a few nosy neighbors fishing for details, and one anonymous message that simply said, "Keep going. Some of us are watching and cheering." When she arrived at Miles's office later that morning, he was already on a call with someone from the DA's office. She heard it in his voice, the controlled sharpness, the speed of thought behind each word. He waved her in mid-sentence. "Yes, Assistant DA Carter, we'll send the full bundle today, financial, medical, audio, and Officer Nolan's sworn statement. Yes, all notarized. No, the victim has remained consistent across every record, no discrepancies." He covered the mouthpiece briefly. "You're going to want to sit for this." Helen eased into the chair. "They're opening a formal review," Miles said after hanging up. "Criminal charges, multiple. The DA is taking it seriously." Helen didn't speak. She simply nodded once, then opened her ledger and wrote the date. Miles sat back and tapped his pen against the edge of his desk. They might try to spin this in the press. Kelly's playing the family card game. David's going to posture. But we're about to walk into a bigger courtroom with a lot more teeth. "And the restitution case?" she asked. He leaned forward. "I'm expanding it to include defamation of character. You were slandered, privately and publicly. We have the recordings, the text messages. We have neighbors as witnesses." He lifted a folder. And Jones printed 27 letters of support from people in the community, former teachers, co-workers, even a retired principal. "It's a paper wall of your character. I'm submitting it with the amended complaint." Helen's throat tightened slightly at that. Not from pride, just quiet, settled strength. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She was defending who she'd always been. It was later that week, back in court for a follow-up hearing, when David snapped. They were only 10 minutes into proceedings. The judge had just confirmed receipt of the updated documents, including the new video exhibits and the DA's pending inquiry. Miles had begun outlining the expanded restitution scope when David, seated stiffly between Kelly and their attorney, stood abruptly. "This is a witch hunt!" he shouted. "You people are buying a fake story from an old lady with a spreadsheet and a grudge." The courtroom stiffened. "Sit down, Mr. Markham," the judge warned. She's trying to destroy my life. Over what? A few bills she would have paid anyway? We're family. And now she's dragging me into court like I'm some scam artist. Officer Nolan was already moving. Calm, practiced. She approached without hurry, hand on her duty belt. "Mr. Markham, step outside with me," she said firmly. David looked ready to spit fire. "You have no idea what she's done." Now. The room watched as Nolan guided him to the exit. No cuffs, no drama, just enough force to puncture his last bubble of control. The door clicked shut behind them. Miles didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, we'd also like to request an emergency freeze of all known joint assets under the defendant's names. This includes any accounts, credit lines, or shared property obtained under Ms. Markham's identity." The judge barely looked up. "Granted." She tapped her pen against the bench. "This court recognizes an urgent risk of continued exploitation. All assets frozen until the criminal review concludes." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Kelly sat frozen, blinking rapidly. In the back row, Joan didn't smile. She just gave a single approving nod and resumed knitting. After the hearing, Helen stepped into the hallway, the buzz of reporters just beyond the doors. Joan caught up to her, waving a fresh printout. "Letter number 28, she said, handing it over. "From Kyle's former math teacher. Said she saw how David talked down to you at parent-teacher night 2 years ago. Said she regretted not speaking up." Helen took it, folded it slowly, then slipped it into her purse. Joan studied her face. "Are you still thinking what I think you're thinking?" Helen turned, eyes focused down the hallway where David had disappeared with Nolan. "This isn't revenge," she said. "It's justice, with a receipt." The email landed in Helen's inbox at 7:43 a.m. Subject: Subpoena. Immediate disclosure required. From hr@ClaremontFundingCorp.com. She barely had time to open it before Joan texted, "Turn on Channel 6. You'll want to see this." She did, and there he was, David, standing outside the entrance of Claremont's downtown office building, looking like a man freshly chewed and spit out by the very system he'd tried to manipulate. His suit was too big, or maybe he had gotten smaller. The camera panned in just close enough to catch him saying, "No comment," 3 times in a row. Helen read the chyron. "Local loan officer under criminal investigation. Company issues internal review." Joan sent a follow-up message. "Guess he finally learned how it feels to be denied a line of credit." Helen took a slow sip of coffee. By noon, Kelly was trending on a regional gossip blog under the tag hashtag Credit Queen Collapse. Screenshots of her frantic Facebook posts were circulating, long, disjointed rants about injustice, cancel culture, and how people were destroying a hardworking family. Her comments were filled with strangers asking how one hardworking family managed to rack up 14 open lines of credit on someone else's name. "Please, if anyone knows a lawyer who isn't afraid of corrupt old women," one of her posts read, "DM me. I'm literally being erased." By 3 p.m., her accounts were set to private. Helen didn't even open the app. She just forwarded the screenshots to Miles. 3 days later, Helen stood outside her front door, watching Officer Nolan slide a folded copy of the restraining order into a clear evidence sleeve. "It's official," Nolan said. "They're not allowed within 500 feet of you, your residence, or your workplace. Any violation, immediate arrest." Helen nodded. "What if I'm home and they come to collect their things?" "They won't," Nolan said, "not without a civil officer present, and not until we're sure everything tied to your stolen credit has been retrieved." Joan stepped outside with a pitcher of lemonade and a look of total satisfaction. Nolan accepted a glass. "You know," she said, "I've worked a lot of these cases. Most victims don't fight this hard." "I wasn't just fighting for me," Helen said. "I was fighting for every woman who's been told to stay quiet and not embarrass the family." "You embarrassed the hell out of them," Joan said, grinning. "Cheers." The eviction notice was served quietly. No big scene, no last-minute screaming match. Just 2 plainclothes marshals and a locksmith stepping out of a gray city vehicle in front of David and Kelly's rental home, leased under an address linked to Helen's frozen credit file. Helen and Joan watched from a parked car across the street. "They never even paid for that furniture," Joan muttered. "Look at all of it." Through the window, movers boxed up an oversized sectional, a fake marble coffee table, and a 72-inch TV that once played Shark Tank at full volume every night until 2 a.m. Helen didn't speak until the last piece was loaded. "They thought they were building a future," she said. "Turns out it was just borrowed time." That weekend, Helen's porch was full. Tupperware containers of lasagna, baked ziti, squash soup, apple pie, rice pudding, mac and cheese, and something that might have been chili but smelled like cinnamon. The casseroles came from neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years, and a few she'd never met at all. A boy from 3 doors down dropped off a tray with a note that read, "For the lady who stood up when no one else would." Helen wiped her hands on a dish towel and blinked at the paper longer than necessary. "You started a movement, you know," Joan said from the kitchen. "You went full grandma and gavel on them." Helen exhaled slowly. She didn't feel like a movement, she just felt like herself again. But just as she reached to put the final casserole in the freezer, the doorbell rang. Joan looked toward the door, then toward Helen. "You expecting someone?" "No." Helen opened the door slowly. A courier in uniform held out an envelope. "Delivery for Helen Markham." She signed. Inside was a certified letter. She unfolded it. A formal notice of bankruptcy proceedings, filed under David and Kelly Markham. At the bottom was a sticky note, written in rushed blue ink. "You win. Happy now?" Helen stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over, and began to write her response. The courtroom was quieter this time. No reporters, no law students, no whispers. Just the thick, waiting stillness of final judgment. Helen sat straight-backed at the plaintiff's table, the soft weight of her wool coat draped over her shoulders. Her folder sat open in front of her, not for show, but out of habit. Order, even now, mattered. Across the aisle, David looked deflated, like air let out of a life raft. His tie was gone, his shirt collar loose, jaw clenched so hard his cheek twitched. Kelly sat next to him with dry eyes, her hands trembling despite her stiff posture. She wore black like someone dressing for a funeral that hadn't yet happened. "Case number 4872-M, Markham vs. Markham," the bailiff intoned. The judge didn't waste time. "This court has reviewed all supplemental filings, witness testimony, financial documentation, and evidence submitted in this matter." She looked directly at Helen. "Ms. Markham, your case was thorough, consistent, and supported by corroborating testimony from both civilian and law enforcement sources." David shifted in his seat. The judge turned her gaze to him. "Mr. Markham, the evidence overwhelmingly supports your mother's claims of identity fraud, financial exploitation, and willful misrepresentation. Your behavior has not only caused personal and financial harm, but has shown a sustained pattern of deceit." Then to Kelly, "Mrs. Markham, this court finds you complicit. Your recorded admissions and public statements corroborate your direct involvement in the abuse." Helen didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She just waited. The gavel came down once. "This court awards full restitution to the plaintiff, including but not limited to repayment of stolen funds, reversal of fraudulent charges, damages for defamation, and complete coverage of legal fees." The clerk began scribbling. "In addition, the defendant's wages shall be garnished, effective immediately. This garnishment will remain active until full repayment is completed." David inhaled like he'd been punched in the stomach. The judge's voice didn't soften. "Ms. Kelly Markham, your complicit role has been submitted to your employer via court record. As of this filing, your professional license is considered under review for misconduct and possible disqualification." A gasp came from Kelly. Not dramatic, not loud, just sharp, real. Helen let out a slow breath. Not relief, not triumph. Closure. "Lastly," the judge continued, "this court notifies all credit agencies that Ms. Helen Markham's credit file is to be restored to pre-incident standing. All fraudulent activity is officially expunged." The courtroom stayed still for a moment longer. Then, "This matter is settled. Court adjourned." The gavel cracked once more. Final. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. Joan waited on the courthouse steps with 2 helium balloons and a tote bag slung over her shoulder. "Too much?" she asked. Helen raised an eyebrow. The one that says, "Bye, losers," might be a bit much for probate court. Joan grinned. Didn't stop me. She handed Helen a printed invitation. Freedom from fools. Potluck and porch drinks at Joan's. Saturday at 4. Already have casseroles promised and a neighbor bringing a folding karaoke machine, Joan added. Helen stared at the flyer, then smiled. Not big, not performative, just quietly, fully. That Saturday, Helen's front porch buzzed with voices and clinking glasses. Neighbors came with dishes and stories, laughter tumbling out into the dusky air like someone had opened a window in a stuffy house and let something fresh in. Joan gave a speech with a cider in one hand and a deviled egg in the other. We are gathered here to celebrate justice, community, and one very dangerous woman with a spreadsheet. Laughter erupted. Miles arrived halfway through with a bottle of red wine and a copy of the final court order in a folder tied with string. Frame it, he told Helen, or wallpaper your office. Later that evening, as the porch lights glowed warm against the siding, Helen sat back in her favorite chair with a slice of lemon pie and watched the people she'd once thought were too busy to care linger longer than usual. But even now the story wasn't entirely over. As the last guest left, Joan stepped beside her, voice lower. Got a letter in my mailbox, she said. No return address. Helen glanced at her. Joan handed it over. Helen opened it. Inside was a single line, cut from a magazine, glued to a white index card. Debt is never the end. The bankruptcy courtroom didn't have the same weight as the last. No judge's gavel, no reporters, no gallery full of observers. Just dull carpeting, paperwork in triplicate, and a trustee who looked like he'd seen this 100 times too many. But Helen was here. And so were they. David sat hunched forward, a man made smaller by every document with his name on it. His shirt was tucked in but wrinkled, and the folder in front of him was thin, too thin. Kelly was pale, her once perfectly dyed hair grown out at the roots. She glanced at Helen only once, and then never again. The trustee adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Filing confirms Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Joint submission by David and Kelly Markham. Petition includes outstanding judgments tied to civil restitution, current wage garnishment, and liabilities outlined by Franklin County Probate Court. He looked at David. Sir, do you understand that your repayment plan will follow you for the next 25 years? David gave a shallow nod. And that your credit will not be fully restorable for at least a decade, possibly longer depending on additional findings? Another nod. And that as of this morning, your request to exclude your wife from shared liability was denied? That one landed. David flinched. Kelly let out a soft, guttural sound, half sob, half swear, and then blinked hard to contain it. The trustee turned toward Helen, seated neatly beside Miles. Ms. Markham, do you have anything you'd like to add before we finalize the court's entry? Helen opened her folder and removed a single page. Her copy of the judgment from the restitution hearing, now rubber-stamped by the county clerk. I just want to confirm, she said evenly, that I will continue receiving the restitution checks on schedule, as determined in the prior ruling. Miles added, and that all outstanding debts owed to Ms. Markham are legally protected from discharge. The trustee nodded. Correct. Bankruptcy protects the debtor from collection by most creditors, but in cases of fraud and financial abuse, that protection doesn't apply. He stamped the file. Entry is final. Helen didn't smile. Not when she stood, not when she turned to leave, not even when Kelly muttered something acidic under her breath as Helen passed. She didn't need to. Miles caught up with her outside, already slipping his sunglasses on. That's it, he said. It's all locked in. Helen looked toward the street. It had started raining, not a downpour, just the soft kind, the sort that feels like erasure more than punishment. Will they try to reopen it? She asked. Miles shook his head. Not unless they find a loophole in the U.S. Code, and I've already sealed it shut. They reached her car, and he handed her a small envelope. First restitution payment arrived this morning. Inside were 2 checks. Modest in size, but real. Tangible. Proof that lies can be reversed, that identity can be returned to its rightful owner piece by piece. Miles tucked his hands into his pockets and looked out toward the courthouse steps. "You know," he said, "David once said you were just a bitter old woman with a ledger, and now he's got 25 years of debt collectors and asset audits knocking on his door." He glanced sideways, dry smile forming. You turned his insult into a sentence. Later that week, Helen found Officer Nolan waiting on her front porch with a cup of coffee and an envelope of her own. "Got the official notification from state court," Nolan said. "Their appeal's already been denied. Fastest rejection I've ever seen." Helen took the paper and slid it silently into her file cabinet behind the folder labeled Final Orders. "You know," Nolan added, "I've watched people try to claw their way out of worse, but it usually ends with the victim more exhausted than protected." Helen met her eyes. "I wasn't alone." "No," Nolan agreed, "but you didn't wait to be rescued either. You built the rescue yourself." That evening, Joan hosted a second Freedom from Fools potluck, this one smaller, quieter. Just neighbors, people who'd watched it all unfold from across their fences and front lawns and mailboxes, people who knew what Helen had endured and what she'd reclaimed. Joan raised a glass in the middle of her living room and said, "To Helen, for every woman who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, erased, or told she was too old to notice." A ripple of cheers, a clink of mismatched glasses. Joan pulled Helen into a hug. "Too old?" she whispered. "Too sharp." Helen hugged her back, tighter than usual. But just before the night ended, she stepped out onto the porch alone. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearer now, lighter, like something heavy had finally lifted. And in the quiet, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Not because she'd won, but because she'd never stopped telling the truth, even when no one else believed her. The conference room wasn't grand, just an aging community center with scuffed parquet floors and a podium that wobbled slightly if you leaned too hard. But every seat was filled. Some came for CEU credit, others came because they'd read the story, and a few came because they'd lived their own version of it, silently, behind closed doors. Helen adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat once, and looked out over a sea of faces. Some curious, some skeptical, some quietly hopeful. "I used to think being the strong one meant keeping things quiet," she began, "not causing trouble, not embarrassing anyone, just enduring." She paused, letting the words settle. "But then I realized that silence wasn't strength, it was surrender. And I'm not interested in surrendering anymore." Soft murmurs of agreement rippled through the back row. She walked them through the basics: fraudulent accounts, forged hospital bills, identity theft buried under the language of family. She never raised her voice, never dramatized. She didn't have to. The facts were heavier than fiction. "I balanced school budgets for 40 years, she said. "But it took 6 months of being stolen from to remember. I was the expert here, not them." A hand went up from the third row, a young woman, maybe early 30s, eyes wide with something like grief. "What was the moment you knew you had to act?" she asked. Helen didn't hesitate. "When I realized my silence had been repurposed into permission." The applause came slowly, almost shyly, but it built, row by row, face by face, until even the folding chairs seemed to lean in. Afterward, people lined up, younger women, older men, a teenage girl whose mother whispered, "She's filing her own police report Monday." They didn't ask for advice. They thanked her for making them feel like they could breathe again. Joan was waiting at the back with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a grin too wide to contain. "You were electric," she said, handing over the bouquet. "Half the women in this room would follow you into battle." Helen laughed softly. "Let's just stick to filing affidavits." On the way out, a local journalist caught them in the hallway with a recorder already running. "Just one quote," she said, "for the follow-up piece." Helen glanced at Joan, then turned to the reporter. "Tell them I didn't ruin my son's life." He did. "I just stopped co-signing the consequences." The next morning's headline ran bold above the fold in the Dispatch: "Grandmother destroys son's financial empire in courtroom showdown." Below it, a photo of Helen at the podium, sleeve rolled just slightly, hand braced on the mic stand like she'd been born to hold it. The nomination came in quietly, through email. Subject, nominee confirmation, Ohio Elder Advocacy Award. Miles forwarded it with a simple line, "They're watching, in a good way this time." Helen didn't answer. She just read the form 3 times, then printed it out, then folded it and slid it behind her final court order like a bookend. The ceremony was small, held in a civic library downtown with gold foil programs and a string quartet playing a little too softly. But when her name was called, and she stepped to the lectern under soft overhead lights, Joan was there in the second row, beaming like she'd raised her. Miles stood at the back, arms crossed, nodding slowly. Helen accepted the award with a simple line, "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it just looks like showing up with proof." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. Helen didn't open it. She recognized the handwriting, the slant of guilt in the loops. Kelly's. She placed the envelope back in its original sleeve and wrote in block letters across the front, "Return to sender." No drama, no speech, no reason to hold anything that wasn't hers anymore. That night, Helen sat on her porch with a cup of tea and the newest envelope from the restitution fund. A soft breeze moved through the hedges. Joan was inside, humming along to some 80s song on the kitchen radio. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime struck a note Helen hadn't heard in years. She reached for her ledger, still tucked beside her chair, opened to the very last page, and wrote, "August 23rd, peace, balance, paid in full." The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, warm against the hardwood. Snow fell outside in slow, quiet swirls, painting the world in layers of stillness. Helen sat at her table in slippers and a wool cardigan, a pen in one hand, a stack of utility bills in the other, each one neatly opened, checked, and marked "paid" in calm blue ink. The ledger was out, naturally, but these days it felt less like armor and more like tradition. She didn't owe anyone, and no one could touch her name again. Her coffee steamed beside her, rich and dark, the way she liked it. She was halfway through today's paper when the phone rang. Miles. She answered without preamble. "Good morning." His voice crackled with good news. "It's official. Franklin County filed the final judgment notice this morning. All charges are finalized. No appeal allowed." Helen closed her eyes for a moment. Not in shock, just in confirmation, like hearing the final click of a lock that had taken too long to turn. "Thanks for calling," she said. "That's not all," Miles added. "I had your credit file reviewed one more time this week. Every fraudulent entry is off. Your FICO's better than mine." Helen chuckled. "That's what 40 years of budgeting on a secretary's salary will teach you." "One more thing," Miles said. "You've got a feature in the Columbus Monthly next week. They're running it under the Faces of Resilience column. Thought you should know." Helen glanced toward her laptop on the counter. A small notification was blinking. "New comment on your blog. The Ledger Lives." She smiled softly. "Seems like it's catching on." "I think you accidentally started a movement," Miles said. "You okay with that?" Helen took a sip of her coffee. "I'm okay with people learning they don't have to say thank you for being betrayed." He laughed. "Well said. Call me if you want to go national." They hung up. Later that morning, she walked down to the credit union, snow crunching gently under her boots, and opened a brand new account. Just her name on the form. No cosigner, no joint access, no one else's fingerprints near her signature line. When the clerk handed her the shiny new debit card, she held it for a second longer than necessary, not for nostalgia, for closure. "First transaction?" the clerk asked. Helen smiled. "Yeah." She stepped over to the coffee kiosk in the lobby and bought herself a $1.25 peppermint cocoa. "Cheers," she whispered. By the time she got home, Joan was already letting herself in through the side door, carrying a pie and a lopsided grin. "You open your new account?" Helen held up the card like a badge. First transaction was sugar. Joan plopped the pie on the counter and rubbed her hands together. "You know, there are women on Reddit calling you the retirement avenger." Helen raised an eyebrow. "What kind of pie is this?" "Justice, with pecans." They both laughed, the kind of laugh that feels earned, not easy, not fleeting, but stitched into the bone. I was thinking, Joan added, settling in at the table, we could write a little e-book. Financial survival for the undermined and unafraid. You'd be the face, I'll be the footnotes. Helen pretended to consider. Only if there's a chapter called How to Freeze a Credit Score and a Heartbeat in One Afternoon. Oh, now that's a title, Joan said, already pulling out her phone to jot it down. The afternoon passed slowly. Neighbors dropped off more casserole containers they forgot to collect. Someone mailed her a candle with a note that read, "For your next courtroom victory, or just bath time." Helen made soup. Joan raided the fridge. The wind chime on the porch swayed in time with nothing at all. Before bed, Helen opened her blog's back end and checked the stats. 3,287 new readers. 28 emails. 4 invitations to speak at elder advocacy groups across the state. She scrolled down to the comments. One caught her eye. "My mom's starting over, because you proved she could." Helen stared at the screen for a long while, then opened a new draft and began typing. "He told me I belonged in a nursing home. I sent him straight into debt collections with no way back." She clicked post, then closed her laptop and turned out the light.